This special episode of Legendary is brought to you by Audible. For a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook, head on over to audible.com/GameBreaker. What's up, everybody, and welcome to this special Friday edition of Legendary. Joining me, as always, Mr. Josh Allen, a.k.a. Lore. How are you, sir?
I'm doing good.
And Olivia D. Grace, WoW Insider contributing editor and GameBreaker.tv contributing editor right here. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
And joining us today, lead systems designer from Blizzard's World of Warcraft, it's Mr. Greg Street. How are you, sir?
I am well. It's great to be back.
Great to have you back on the show. And joining us for the first time is Ion Hazzikostas, lead encounter designer. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Great to be here. Great to join you guys.
Great to have you guys on the show. Love putting you guys in the chopping block. Here we go. Since the last we talked, what lessons have you guys learned from Tier 14 to apply to Tier 15?
Several lessons, I think. So first off, having a nice big tier is a good thing. We'd like to keep doing that in the future, and certainly a trend that we're continuing with 12 or 13 bosses in Tier 15, depending on which ones you're counting, and that's certainly a nice meaty size for a raid tier. But we've also learned, some more specific lessons. I think one thing that I've mentioned a couple of times, looking at how some of the normal mode encounters in Tier 14 played out, I think that we often stressed just strict DPS checks a bit too much. We had some hard berserk timers, and that caused some frustration for groups that were trying to progress on normal mode. And going into Tier 15, I think we'd like to make the encounters and success on the encounters on normal mode more about really mastering the mechanics. I think for a normal mode group, it can be very frustrating when you get over your initial wipes because you're not quite understanding what to do or how to handle what the boss is throwing at you. You figure that out. And then suddenly the boss is at 10%, you're feeling good, you think you're about to win, and he becomes big and red and goes into a berserker rage and kills you all. and then you just have the question of, well, what do we do now? If it's at 1%, well, okay, pull again, break out that 300 stat food, yell at the one guy who didn't have his flask up, and you win. But if it's at 10%, maybe you just have to wait a couple weeks to get more gear. You suddenly start pressuring the guy who maybe is underperforming a little bit to go start reading third-party sites and figuring out how to play his class better. And that's really not what we want normal mode rating to be about. You should feel like you learn the boss mechanics, you win, move on to the next boss. So hopefully you have a lot of really exciting and varied mechanics to throw at you in Tier 15, and players should have a lot of fun learning them.
Absolutely. Do you have any particular favorite standout boss that you really think was a great one this particular tier?
In Tier 14 or 15?
14.
So I guess, bunch of ones that I really enjoyed. A personal favorite would probably have to be, and this is maybe not experienced by as many players, but the heroic mode of the Spirit Kings encounter in Mogushan Vaults. It just has a very, very dynamic feel to it, and a handful of abilities that interact in very different ways to cause entirely different reactions depending on the order and the ways in which they line up. Can be a very frustrating fight for some raid leaders as you're trying to get all of your people that you're hurting into, the right mindset. But that's one that I think we really enjoyed, and that brings out some of the best of what raiding can be about.
The team came under, I guess I could say, a bit of flack at the start of Mists, thanks to all the dailies. And then in 5.2, you guys changed how the dailies and rep gear worked. What was your philosophy behind the new approach?
I think just looking back, I mean, we talked about this a little before, but what we were trying to do coming into Mists was just provide players a lot of endgame content so that even when they were done raiding for the day or, they were locked out or whatever, they still had plenty of things to do and they felt like they could progress their character by going out in the world. We just provided a lot of content. There were a lot of different reward mechanisms. It was fairly complicated that you had to do things like, oh, if you get exalted with Golden Lotus, there's a special reward there that you may not know about, and things like that. Overall, we just wanted to kind of simplify the system, let players who were not interested at all in doing daily quests feel like they could take that stance without really hurting their group. while still giving lots and lots of new content for people that like to raid and do quest, or just quest and not raid at all, which is really more of what the new island is about.
Let's move on to patch 5.2 stuff. Let's talk a little bit about that. Item upgrades. Are they ever coming back? And from some recent tweets and posts that we've seen, it doesn't sound likely.
To be honest, we haven't decided yet. What we really liked, there are a couple things we really liked about the item upgrades. They felt really good for players coming in with blue gear who were just maybe a couple item levels shy of being able to get into dungeons or raids. That felt really good. What felt really bad were the hard decisions people could get into sometimes of, well, I've got this item, I'm almost Valor capped, but I'm scared my guild's going to be able to kill a heroic boss next week, and then I'd have a better item, and that kind of, analysis paralysis where it wasn't fun to spend your Valor and feel like you might be wasting it. If we could solve those problems, we might bring it back, but honestly, we're just not sure yet.
What do you think the chances are if you do end up bringing it back? How's that going to interact with the Thunderforge system as well? Are we going to have like heroic Thunderforged, 1 of 2, etc.?
I think the existence of Thunderforged items, I think, sort of reinforces Greg's point about the importance of solving that analysis paralysis problem, as he put it. We certainly don't want people to feel like you shouldn't ever upgrade a normal mode item because what if the Thunderforged version of it drops and then you feel like you wasted your upgrade, or anything along those lines. Options include potentially allowing you to somehow get a partial refund or maybe transfer your upgrade from one piece to the other. Really, the purpose of the upgrade system is for people to be excited about spending the Valor points they have, and immediately upgrading their gear. We envisioned it as the second you hit 750, you run off to the vendor or to the upgrades NPC, and you become stronger, and that should be something that you celebrate. Instead of you get all the way up to 3,000, and then, okay, well, I'm at the Valor cap, I have to upgrade something now. Strategically, what's the thing I'm least likely to replace anytime soon? And that's not exactly as fun or exciting. At the same time, this steady stream of player power progression from knowing that you can reliably upgrade something every week has a lot of positive benefits. We didn't have the sort of progressive nerfs through Tier 14 that we had seen in previous tiers, such as Dragon Soul. And a big part of why that was the case and why guilds really were able to continue to progress at a steady rate was due to things like the upgrade system that meant that people reaching an encounter in January were much stronger than people who reached it in December or November. And that if you're stuck on something, you know that even if you don't personally get an upgrade from a drop, you're still going to be a little bit stronger next week than you are today.
Is there a reason why the new raid's progression path is completely linear?
It's ultimately, it just ended up being the flow that we came up with for the story we were trying to tell and the progression through the zone, from the Zandalari ruins at the entrance to the zone, through this sort of underground forgotten grotto beneath the foundations, up through the dungeons and experimental, almost torture chamber areas of Lei Shen, finally into his inner sanctum. It's something that we don't really have necessarily a fixed formula for. I think there are definitely upsides to having sort of forks or branches or little nexus areas like you saw in Blackwing Descent, where you can kind of pick which boss to tackle first, but you have to do them all before you can advance. Tier 15 doesn't feature any of those features, but something that I think is likely to come back in future tiers.
Let's talk about Jinrock a bit. So Jinrock, it's sort of, I guess, closest Tier 15 offers to a patchwork fight. Is that the style of boss that you really just don't want to do anymore?
A pure patchwork fight, I think it's something that players don't really want to do anymore. Unfortunately, I think it's sort of, there's some sort of glamorous ideal of, patchwork, the glory days of Naxxramas. Ultimately, what it boils down to, though, is a glorified target dummy with some cool visuals when you're talking about the actual player experience. Patchwork was a nail-biting encounter for the healers, maybe, who were staring at the tank's health pools. But other than that, what was distinctive about it at the time was that it literally was just, okay, if you're a DPS class, you have to really push yourself as hard as you can for 6-7 minutes straight, and that's it. Today, the feedback we more commonly hear from players is, well, I want something to do on the fight. If we make an encounter where the mechanics don't target melee, they only target ranged players, and the ranged experience is you just stand there and stab the boss for several minutes, that's not really as engaging. So I think we try to provide more player involvement and interaction wherever possible. So Jinrock certainly isn't a fight with a lot of ads. He definitely is sort of a hulking brute. It's not a very long encounter, but at the same time, there's movement. There are mechanics that melee have to worry about. You're changing your position throughout the room over the course of the fight to take advantage of available buffs. And while DPS matters, it's not the only thing that matters.
If there's any risk that, thanks to the absence of one of these sort of pure or the Ultraxian fight, for example, where there's minimal complication, that it may just make these raids a little bit too challenging, particularly for the easier tiers?
Ultimately, I think it just depends all on our tuning. As I mentioned, I think the combination of really involved mechanics with a really strict DPS check, I think, is what often does stray into the territory of being too challenging, particularly for normal mode encounter. Most players aren't capable of performing the rotations flawlessly while also not standing in the fire and running around and dodging this and dodging that, and we shouldn't ask them to do that, certainly not on normal modes. So I think as long as we make sure that we're avoiding a situation where, unless you're playing your rotation perfectly, you're going to run into a berserk timer or some kind of hardened rage, I think it should be fine. I mean, the Ultraxian encounter actually, while it didn't have much movement, it did have a very tight DPS check, and that was the primary difficulty of the fight. So for these encounters, we're just placing that difficulty elsewhere, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more difficult, just different.
Where do you guys see the role of the LFR in gear progression now? Is everyone meant to run LFR before stepping into normals, or is that something that's optional?
I think it's optional. LFR is kind of its own progression. There are a lot of people who are not members of raiding guilds and don't raid with a regular group, and they're taking their LFR gear from Heart of Fear, Terrace of Endless Spring, and they're going to use that to go into Throne of Thunder LFR. The item level placement of the current LFR gear from Tier 15 is that it's slightly better than the normal mode drops from Tier 14. If you've upgraded your normal mode drop from Tier 14, LFR gear is not going to be better. If your normal mode drop from Tier 14 has an optimal stat combination, the LFR drop also likely might not be better. And realistically, we expect that normal mode raiders are going to go right into normal mode Throat of Thunder and start getting the item level 522 rewards there. The wings of LFR are going to see a staggered release, much like we've done in Tier 14 and Tier 13 before that. So realistically, a couple of months from now, gearing up in LFR might be a very attractive option. But by the time that is a possibility, we expect the typical normal mode raider to have a large amount of 522 gear from the Throne of Thunder normal modes. If people want to run LFR for Valor, they should feel free to do so. But we've tried where possible to remove the things that were forcing guild raiders or making them feel pressured to do LFR every week. So for example, the 5-2 legendary quest line, you progress it by getting drops, but those drops can only be obtained from a given boss once per week, regardless of difficulty. So if you kill Jinrock in normal mode, LFR Jinrock simply cannot drop the legendary piece that you need for your quest progression. Therefore, there's no advantage gained in terms of legendary progression. Similarly, you can only gain the raid reputation with the Shadow Pan from one boss in a given difficulty a week. So again, if you're clearing the zone on normal, nothing to gain from LFR unless you want Valor. If you want Valor and you choose to do LFR to get that Valor, then feel free.
All right. I have to ask this, or our community will absolutely hang me out to dry. And I'm sure you guys are completely sick of answering this one. Limited attempts. How do you think world first guilds are going to approach these? Because some have been saying they're just going to run all raids to get extra attempts. What do you guys think?
I think the limited attempts, it's something we're trying again as an experiment here, and it's about stressing quality over quantity of attempts. The guilds that get to Raden first on heroic mode will no doubt have put in quite a lot of time, quite a lot of quantity of overall attempts and progression over the first couple of weeks of the accessible heroic raids. But Raden's going to be about using those 30 attempts each week intelligently and tactically. Now, we don't expect that they're going to actually have alt raids there. If we did, we probably wouldn't have gone ahead with the system. I think that one of the features of the limited attempt on a heroic-only boss that is gated behind a whole zone of heroic progression is that you actually have to get your alts there. If you look back to limited attempts in Icecrown Citadel, I think they had some upsides and downsides. Major downsides, using them on normal mode at all, I think was out of place. The quantity of attempts, at the start at least, was quite low. You had 10 attempts total, when that was first introduced, such that if someone disconnected on a pull, if you lost your tank went offline, you lost 10% of your chances for the week based on a random fluke. That certainly was frustrating. And then finally, its use on wing bosses that you could pretty much take any group of alts right up to meant that the right thing to do for the high-end guilds was to spend tons and tons of time practicing and wiping on alts before doing their real pulls. And that's not really terribly fun. That's just sort of this artificial complexity that's introduced. So we want to avoid all of those things. But Heroic Lich King, you couldn't do Heroic Lich King at all unless you had defeated Putricide Syndragosa and Blood Queen Lanethel on Heroic mode. And during the first weeks of Icecrown Citadel, no one could do that with their alt guilds. Because with their alt raids, the alt raids simply weren't well geared enough. Part of why top-end guilds run a raid that is half alts, half mains, is to funnel gear to the mains, so that your mains are as optimally equipped as possible. So if you look at the top guilds in the world, I'm sure that we'll see them this coming week in Throne of Thunder. They'll go in with a raid of half mains, half alts, and mains will get all the loot. That means that their mains are going to be really, really well geared for when the heroic raid opens, and they can start working on that. It also means their alts are going to be not so well geared. So we simply don't think we're going to see guilds actually clear through all 12 bosses on heroic mode, including Heroic Lei Shen, with a raid full of alts. These are really tightly tuned encounters. The guilds that work on them initially are going to be under-geared for it. And if you look back to, world first kills on bosses like Heroic Ragnaros, on Spine of Deathwing, on Heroic Shaw of Fear, if you ask those guilds, hey, okay, could you turn around and do this with your alts right now? The answer would have been no. A few weeks down the line, maybe, but a few weeks down the line is too late if you're looking for world first. So we hope the experience is going to kind of play out sort of in a pure sense. If it ends up not being the case, or if there are serious bugs with the encounter, or things that otherwise make it unfair and unfun for the people that are there, we can remove the limited attempts via hotfix and just let the boss stand as normal. But we'll see when we get there.
All right, let's talk a bit about some new features in 5.2. So have you guys changed your thinking behind scenario design with 5.2, with the new solo scenarios? Did the scenarios perform as you had hoped in 5.1?
So the scenarios that are in 5.2 are kind of scenarios in name only. Behind the scenes, we use the scenario tech to give players a unique experience where it might feel weird to see a lot of other players doing the same thing at the same time. But it's not a scenario in the sense that you're not going to go queue for it. You're not going to run these over and over again. They're kind of almost like individualized instanced quests, really. We don't have any scenarios in the 5.0 sense of a 3-player scenario for this patch. We're going to do some in future patches. From a philosophical sense, I think we're still trying to figure out exactly where they fit in the game. They're still really cool. We like the idea a lot. We don't think they've lived up to their full potential by any stretch. We're still kind of in the Wailing Caverns, Ragefire era of scenario design, and we think that after we figure out what's really fun about them, after several patches from now, they'll be a really strong contributor to the game, and they just have to evolve a little bit. They are a pretty good source for gearing up alts now. You can get decent gear out of them. They have no queue, so if you're, say, a DPS class waiting for a dungeon or a raid finder queue, you can often run a scenario, and by the time you finish, your other queue will be ready. So they're pretty good that way.
Is there any worry about people purposely wiping a few times to get more determination stacks in LFR?
Yes, there's worry, and I think there are measures in place to make that not the right thing to do. You have to have been in combat with the boss for a while in order for it to count as an attempt. You can't just have your hunter pull the boss and feign. You, in fact, can't really pull the boss's raid and just sort of intentionally lose. You have to do a bit more. I don't want to get into exact numbers because it just invites people to think about gaming the system. But suffice it to say that if we see people doing that, we're going to raise that threshold further and further until it's not the right thing to do. At the point where you decide that you need to spend 15 minutes chain wiping to a boss intentionally to get a couple of stacks of determination just so that you can win, well, why didn't you just pull it and try in the first place? Odds are good you would have won. So, yeah, that's something we're concerned about, but we think we have measures in place to avoid.
And how about in 5.2 with tap to faction for world bosses and shared taps on rare mobs? Are you guys worried that people will tap things and then just not participate?
There's potentially some concern. It depends on what we're talking about. In terms of Nalak, some people may be there and may tap it and may get loot just by being there. the reality is that's often not very different from what plays out with Shaw of Anger today. I think if you look at your typical full Shaw of Anger raid group and you actually look closely at the damage meters, what's really going on in those raids, maybe that guy was a ghost for 90% of the fight. Maybe he was occasionally auto-shooting the boss, and that was about it. But he gets killed just the same. So I mean, that's not really not something that's different. I think in the particular case of Undasta, who's a much more challenging world boss, he himself is located on an island that's full of elite dinosaurs. It's not a place that you're just going to casually stroll along and come across him in combat. We expect organized groups to be going out there for the most part, and not to really see enough player traffic that we're going to have some of those issues arise. It's more similar to going back to really the old school vanilla world bosses, the area in the Tainted Scar around Kazakh, or the Green Dragon Shrines, that were not safe places for your solo character to just walk along. You needed a group with you, otherwise you're going to die there. So we're not really as concerned about just stray tag-alongs in that particular setting.
And I just want to add, how great is it that I'm sitting here doing an interview where we get to use terms like elite dinosaurs?
It is a good thing. Greg, actually, I'm following. You mentioned a while back on Twitter that you hadn't announced the big game changer for Mists yet. Anything on that?
Not yet. I think anything I do at this point is just going to fuel the fire to the point where no matter what it is, people will be disappointed because they'll have built it up into some kind of Path of the Titan / Dance Studio hybrid.
We're not going to forget. We're not going to just let it slide and just go away. We're just going to keep asking you every time around.
Yeah. Ian, are you planning to join Greg on Twitter anytime soon?
Perhaps.
I think that said it all.
If you haven't noticed, I like words, and I like using words, and maybe more than 180 characters worth, but we'll see.
So I can look forward to like 9-10 tweets in a row of just like trying to finish your thought.
Exactly.
140, 280. All right, here we go. All right, let's look at some PvP. Everybody wants to hear about some PvP. So there were various nerfs to blanket silences and certain CCs on the early part of the PTR. Why were those reverted?
Would the PvP game be better with fewer silences? I think definitely. I think a lot of PvP players would agree. But if we had just taken them out, kind of unilateral disarmament, we're scared healers would have been impossible to stop at that point. There's so many instant heals, Holy Paladins running around with Holy Shock and Word of Glory and things like that. We just felt like to really bilaterally disarm, we would have had to strip out a lot of the instant heals and required healers to expose themselves to interrupts and school lockout, which would have been a really big change to make in the game at this stage. Would have had huge PvE ramifications for players who are like, why does Holy Shock no longer a shock? It's a cast time spell. So we ultimately decided this was just not the right time to make that change. Definitely in the future, I think you'll see fewer silences in PvP.
So is that something like next expansion then?
Yeah, it feels like more of an expansion level thing, not the kind of thing we'd spring on people in the middle of a current series of linked arena seasons.
Yeah, I agree. It'd be a bit of a shock. So the PvP blog you put out a little while back highlighted several sort of what I think you call problem classes in 5.1. Do you think you've done enough to even things out in 5.2? I mean, obviously it's hard to tell from the PTR, but...
Yeah, I mean, judging the PTR, everyone's been nerfed to the point of no longer viable, or we didn't actually fix the problems, depending on who you ask. But, I mean, we hit mages and warriors pretty hard. We gave some nice buffs, we hope, to, like, discipline priests and rogues, and we just like to even things out a little more. So it looks positive overall, but, we'll find out here in a couple weeks.
How did you guys decide on the new PvP gearing system? Did you guys think that removing the 2200 rating was players were gonna pursue higher ratings?
It was really a combination of. So there are a lot of things that go into it. You have to go back and look at the blog where we try to outline some of our logic there. But we felt like there's a certain group of PvP players that they're gonna get the best gear no matter what, and for them the real challenge doesn't even really kick in until the point where they feel like they and all of their competitors are kind of evenly geared. And that takes a pretty big commitment of earning all that conquest gear. At the same time, we feel like we haven't done a great job of offering rewards for PvP that aren't gear. We give out the gladiator mounts and the BG mounts and things like that. But overall, I think we underestimated the demand there would be for prestige rewards and cool titles and things like that. So we're trying to shift the gear back a little bit more to seeing a guy in like the full badass elite tyrannical, you know that is a force to be reckoned with. And you can strut around a little bit in the shrines wearing that gear and have people part before you like water and that sort of thing.
What was the thinking behind delaying the Conquest catch-up system to patch 5.3 rather than bringing it in like halfway through 5.2, for example?
It wasn't really for design reasons. It was it's just a big new feature to implement, and we didn't want to hold the entire patch back for that system. It's something we're still working on, and ideally it'll be the kind of thing you see in patch 5.3.
Cool. And obviously also the upgrade system, which you'd been talking about earlier in a PvE context, that was kind of one of the big issues for PvP gearing this time around. Is that taken in? Obviously that's taken into consideration, but what do you think about bringing the upgrade system back for PvP specifically?
I think it's very unlikely to come back for PvP, to be honest. The benefits it had in PvE were not things we really felt in PvP at all, and I just think it probably did more harm than good there. So no promises, but I'd say we're leaning against it right now.
So great having you guys back on the... What's up? You have the last one?
Yeah, sorry, one last one. Skirmishers. Yes, no, maybe?
It was
Are they coming back ever?
I would certainly like them to come back. There's a lot of players that would like to see them. There's a really interesting story of what happened to them and how they all went away. But in retrospect, I wish they hadn't. And I hate to promise it because I think it's a lot of work to get them back in there. But we also understand that some players really miss them. So it's definitely on our list.
Guys, thanks for coming on the show. And by the way, you guys knocked it out of the park this week with that trailer. The 5.2 trailer was awesome, and everybody's loving it.
That was our writers and our artists knocking it out of the park, and yeah, it was an amazing thing.
I'll include all of you guys in there, even people who clean floors and stuff like that. We'll give them a little props. But Greg, thanks for coming on the show.
Anytime.
Ian, thank you so much for coming on the show. Always looking forward to it. Anytime you guys want to come on, you're more than welcome. And you guys got some cool stuff going on at PAX, I hear.
Yeah. We're looking forward to see what the response to that is.
So everybody keep your eye on the Twitter and the news feeds for that. For all your World of Warcraft news, keep it locked and dialed in right here to GameBreaker.tv all day, every day. And be sure to watch Legendary, our World of Warcraft show, every Thursday. It's live every Thursday at 8 PST. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.